Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Global Markets Recovery and Opportunity Panel. We are all honored to be here with you today. My name is Jennifer Diggins, and I am the Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs for Albemarle Corporation. Albemarle is a global specialty chemicals company, and we have market-leading positions in our three core businesses, which are bromine, catalysts, and lithium. As the world's largest lithium producer, we have great interest in being part of this panel today, being part of this dialogue, and really getting into some of the critical issues, opportunities, and challenges facing the industry in a post-COVID world. I am joined here today by a distinguished panel of guests, including Daniel Witt, who is the public policy lead for Lucid Motors. Welcome. Kevin Miller, who is the Director of Public Policy from ChargePoint, and Prasanna Srinivasan, who is the Global Market Manager for Parker Lord Corporation. Welcome to you all. I am going to call on you individually to give 5-minute remarks, and then we will follow that up with a Q&A period. So welcome to everyone. And Daniel, if I could ask you to start with your remarks, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be with everybody on this panel today and with all those who are attending virtually. This panel is very well suited, I think, and apropos given the state of the country, the state of the world. So again, many compliments to the organizers for the event for being able to put it on in this in such a sophisticated fashion. Again, my name is Daniel Witt. I am the public policy lead for Lucid Motors. Lucid is one of the newest entrants into the automotive space. We are still pre-market, but our first vehicle, the Lucid Air, which is behind me, will be launched in the United States early next year. What makes me very excited to participate in this panel is that not only are we looking at it from a global perspective in the promulgation of EV technology, but it really captures what I think is a really pivotal moment in the history of EV adoption. Certainly, we can look at many companies who have invested millions and billions of dollars of resources in this technology just to get to this point. But where we sit in 2020 is really, I think, at the starting line of a decade of immense transformation for EV adoption, both in the United States as well as globally. We're already seeing this coming to fruition in several international markets. Certainly, Norway is well known for their policies that have led to their much greater levels of adoption. More closer to home, there are policies that have been in effect now for almost a decade that have really compelled automakers to put these vehicles on the road. There's been a long tail to actually seeing the technology reach up with the ambitions of both automakers and the regulators to ultimately get the technology to a level where consumers feel most comfortable adopting the technology as replacements for their internal combustion engine vehicles. I would submit to you, with our technology and with that coming from other automakers in the near future, we are really at that inflection point. And so it comes as no surprise then that frankly you'd see regulators and political leaders like Governor Gavin Newsom taking this moment in time to ultimately push for much greater levels and much more ambitious targets of 100% sales by 2035. Lucid, like several other automakers, supports that, not strictly because it adheres to our business model, but also because we believe it's both the right time and the right framing for how automakers and the public should ultimately think about the trajectory of how this technology is embraced. Of course, if California is leading the way on this, you can imagine the Section 177 states coming on board shortly thereafter, or in line with that. And what's very interesting is that this is all happening at the same time as the EU is pushing forward with their agenda as well. If you look at their targets for electrification, which are slotted in around 2030, the percentage of electric vehicles that are ultimately required for hitting their targets are about north of 50%. That just so happens to probably be right around where the states that embrace the clean car standards will have to be at as well. So we're starting to see not only this inflection point in the industry, but we're also starting to see commonality with the regulatory schemes across different countries, and that is, I think, that's key for automakers who ultimately want certainty and want to dedicate themselves further to this technology. So this is a very long way of saying I'm excited to be here, and I'm very excited for where the pace of this technology and where it's headed in the coming years. We think there's a great deal of promise for this industry in the years to come.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Kevin, if you wouldn't mind coming in and making your comments. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be virtually here with you all. My name is Kevin Miller. I'm the Director of Public Policy for ChargePoint. To give you a little background on us, since 2007, ChargePoint's been committed to make it easy for businesses and drivers and riders to go electric with the largest EV charging network and broadest set of charging solutions available. We have a cloud subscription platform and software-defined charging hardware that create options for every charging scenario from home to multifamily to workplace, parking, hospitality. Everywhere that drivers go is part of the new refueling ecosystem, and we've built our company around that. And we're creating the new fueling network to make sure that, at the end of the day, all people and goods can move electric. And I'll echo a previous point from Daniel to say, it is an incredibly exciting time to be working in the electric transportation space. It's also really important because it's going to be a key part of the solution to a lot of the issues that have been coming right up before us as a result of the pandemic. And I think it's clear that there have been some impacts across the board. And it's no different in the electric transportation space, but I think it's going to be short term on electric mobility, those impacts, and that there is strong and clear trajectory of EV momentum, and that will prevail across all categories. And transportation really continues to be a compelling solution for businesses and drivers that isn't going to change as a result of the pandemic. And in fact, because of where we are now, right, both globally and locally, we're inarguably at a technical, economic and socio-political inflection point. From a technological perspective, better batteries, smarter charging that can intelligently meet a wide range of charging needs from individual to fleets. From a socio-political perspective, there have been some recent exciting announcements out of California that by 2035, all cars and passenger vehicles sold in that state would be zero emission. And at the subnational level, there's an agreement between 15 states and the District of Columbia to ensure that by 2050, all medium and heavy duty vehicles will be electric. Nationally, from the United States perspective, in Canada, at a transnational level, across the EU, there's clear bipartisan support for moving forward. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fundamental facts of the environmental and economic benefits as a result of transportation electrification. From an individual perspective, while individuals don't typically make decisions about what to purchase for a vehicle on a total cost of ownership perspective. We're getting to parity there, but I think what's really going to help accelerate an increased access to the benefits of clean transportation is when we see a greater emphasis on fleet electrification from light to medium and heavy duty vehicles. And that's going to increase access both to the benefits of clean transportation itself, but all the societal benefits that come with it, from lower costs to ratepayers as a result of creating beneficial grid load, to the very benefit of just eliminating tailpipe emissions, as well as all of the economic benefits across the board. And I think once we really zero in on fleet operators, it's rare in life that folks who travel in policy circles get to create and tailor efforts that are directed towards rational economic actors, because a fleet operator is like the only example in the real world of a rational economic actor. So we're at this crossroads where we see all these pieces coming together, and I think I'll end there and just say looking forward to the discussion and digging into thinking about how we make this inflection point a foregone conclusion.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you. And last, but certainly not least, Prasanna, it's your turn.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. So I really appreciate EDTA pulling this event together. Thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction. My name is Prasanna Srinivasan. I'm the Global Market Manager at Parker Lord Corporation. So Lord Corporation used to be a private company until about a year ago when we got acquired by Parker Hannifin. So we primarily focus on materials that go into automotive electronics, and a variety of other automotive applications. Over the last 6 or 7 years, our focus has been heavily into the electric vehicle space, where we supply thermal management materials as well as structural adhesives focused on the electric vehicle powertrain. We are the leading provider of thermal management solutions globally, work with just about every single automotive OEM and battery manufacturer around the globe. So with that being said, I agree with both Daniel and Kevin. Really exciting time to be in the EV space. I used to actually be in EVs back in 2012, 2011 timeframe, when EVs were still very much a novel idea. There were 1 or 2 EVs models and companies focused on it, but it still felt like a long way away, right? And fast forward just 8 years, and it's a very different time. I think a lot of it has to do with improvement in technology, reduction in costs, but it's really a lot of things coming together at the same time, right? So OEMs are starting to invest, as Daniel mentioned. As Kevin pointed out, it's something around climate change and awareness, and people wanting to move away from internal combustion engine into EV. The incredible scale that's been achieved specifically on the battery side from companies like LG and CATL and Panasonic and others. And so it's all come together. And so the interesting thing was the question always kept coming up was, when is that inflection point going to happen? When is EVs, when are they really going to take off? Yeah, we see the investment. Yeah, we see a lot of things happening, but when is that, momentum going to happen? And I think the pandemic might actually be one of those big events that truly shifts the markets towards EV, right? And remains to be seen how the next 3 or 4 years are going to play out. But I think in my mind, it's very clear that the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, one of the big winners will be EV. And certainly we have exciting companies like Lucid and others that are jumping in, but also the traditional OEMs. They've been getting ready for this time for a while now, and I think it's all going to come together in the coming 3 to 5 years to really propel EVs into the next level of adoption. And so it's a really exciting time, right? It's exciting time if you've been in the industry for a while. And waiting for this to happen, it's super exciting. So with that, I'll turn it over to you once again, Jennifer, but very happy to be here as part of the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. There's a few common themes in the comments that you made, and The first one really is, what the short-term versus long-term impact is going to be on the sector. And so let's dig a little bit deeper into that. I think several of you mentioned probably a short-term impact. When we talk about short-term impact, and I'm really asking this from the vantage point of that I have as a lithium producer, understanding how the pricing pressures of lithium in the market, and some of the slowdowns that we have seen as a result of the slowdown in EV adoption. When you say short term, are we talking 3 years? Are we talking 5 years? What do you think is the time frame we're looking at before we're back up and running, probably to pre-COVID levels? And so, Prasanna, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Sure. So for me, if you're thinking about comparing pre-COVID, getting back to pre-COVID levels, I think that's going to be very short term, right? So I think the pandemic is going to upend the automotive industry. And if you're looking at the traditional internal combustion engine, I think getting back to the pre-COVID days in terms of volumes and productions and all of that, that's probably a few years away. I think for EVs, it's absolutely going to be much shorter than that. And I think the big driver for that is clearly the stimulus and the subsidies and the bailout money that's coming in. So you look at the different regions, right? Each region's handled it a little differently. China said very early on, 3-4 years ago, maybe even longer than that, that EV is going to be a cornerstone of what they're going to do going forward. So coming out of the COVID, they were very strong in the subsidy policy. They pushed out when the subsidy was going to end from 2020 to 2022. So their focus has been on what they call NEVs, new energy vehicles, and they've gone full steam ahead. I think Europe is the surprising thing coming out of COVID that we've seen, and so you see different countries all put together slightly different bailout packages, but the commonality is there is overwhelming favor for or attention towards EVs, and in fact you've seen in 2020 already that Europe has overtaken China in terms of EV adoption. So I think the US is clearly lagging behind there. Part of that is the fact that some of the subsidies have gone away, but certainly US is also waiting for a lot of things to happen in the coming weeks and months in terms of the political climate. But I think different regions have handled it differently. But I think for me, the way I look at it is getting back to pre-COVID levels and even going past that for EVs is much shorter term compared to traditional ICE.
Good, thank you. Daniel, would you like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think as Prasanna mentioned, it's very much specific to how the individual regions have handled it. I think there's an interesting data point out there that the latest reports out of Germany were that every automaker suffered some kind of drop in sales over the course of this year, but one manufacturer, the manufacturer that only sells electric vehicles, and their market share went up significantly in that market. That's not to suggest that that's going to be the same across the globe. China seems to be on its own trajectory, which nobody mentioned it in their opening remarks. It almost seems like it's a default that country is going to be moving exceptionally fast with EV adoption, given their policies and the mandates. The U.S. Again, as Prasanna mentioned, is on its own pathway. I tend to think that the era of the need for ongoing stimulus dollars or subsidies is going to be coming to an end increasingly quickly, just given where we are in terms of not only the drop in battery prices, but also conjoining with that the lowering of costs with the other componentry. One of the things that makes Lucid so different than other automakers is that our technology allows us to get well above for miles per kilowatt hour. We're stretching for 5. And when you're able to get that amount of range with that low cost of battery, the economics, to what Kevin mentioned, become increasingly relevant for even the most penny pinching actors. As a result, again, to what Prasanna mentioned, I think that from a global economics perspective, you saw people pull back this year and attempt to conserve for very, very good reasons. The market is likely to return in terms of automotive sales in the coming years. In that vein, you may actually see the percentage of EVs drop as the greater number of vehicles it comes back in the market. That will be offset by new entrants. You've got the global automakers that have been on this, that have not necessarily been fully engaged in this, but are coming to market in a very compelling way in the coming years, and that will lead to a more gradual increase in automotive sales. I think the last point to mention here is, though, that we'd be remiss, and we've sort of touched on it in a variety of ways in our comments, but regulation has played such an important role in the levels of adoption in each of these countries. And the US, due to the political climate, due to individual state actors, is again at an inflection point where likely the regulations are going to have to increase fairly dramatically, which will push those levels of adoption up even further.
Thank you. Kevin, anything you'd like to add to this?
Sure, thanks. So from an infrastructure perspective, I'd like to first quickly give some context for ChargePoint and our business model, so that you get some sense for what we've seen so far this year and what we expect to see moving forward. So ChargePoint, we've got 115,000 charging spots in our network, and by and large, we don't own any of those. We sell and provide these charging solutions to independent owners and operators, and there isn't one solitary business case for charging, because charging ultimately complements and augments existing models, where in many cases charging is provided as an amenity, which goes to complement the fact that you charge where you park. So having all of those different use cases in mind, from residential to retail, we have seen an understandable slowing, right, in retail, hospitality, and workplaces where shelter-in-place orders were coming on over this year. At the same time, that made residential and multifamily charging even more important than it already was. And 60 to 80% of charging is taking place in a residential context. As we see the market shift and change, and as we see increasing fleetification of the transportation sector, that'll change. But in terms of the short-term impact, I think it hasn't been just a static stumbling block. It's been a shift in focus. But as we look to recovery and how that turns around, a lot of these pieces are naturally in front of us anyway, where around the world, we're looking at what are the investments that we already have to make, as societies, the transportation infrastructure at a baseline level. And we're thinking about, well, is it just the roads and bridges that we've relied on previously, or do we need to think about what that next level of infrastructure has to bring to it? So at the same time, I don't want to underplay the impact that the coronavirus has had on families and businesses and communities in any way. I think in trying to look and think about where we go next, it's allowed us to experience what a world would be like with fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and that's going to inform some of these conversations that we have at local, state, provincial, national levels, and it'll take advantage of some of those naturally intersecting pivotal points that we're coming right upon. So there have been impacts. We're seeing how those have changed the focus and where the market's going, but I think the fundamentals are still in place and are only going to be accelerated by the fact that 2020 is the year of the fleet. We've seen increasing numbers of electric fleet pilots that are becoming programs that are becoming the new normal. So it's an exciting time, and I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. So we have touched upon government policies and regulations globally, but I think it's definitely worth us drilling down a little bit further into those government policies and regulations. I think all of us agree that the EU has been a very surprising bright spot in all of this. When the EU declared a month or two ago that any recovery that they had would be a green recovery, and that they would make piles of money literally available for research and development and for partnerships with industry for green technologies. And they really are working towards the goal that they settled on this week of a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. You have long-term policy goals in the EU, like the Green New Deal, the batteries directive, so that they can start preparing for when lithium-ion batteries from EVs come back into the waste stream and what you can do with them. You look at the strides that have been made really across the globe. China, extending those subsidies for a couple of years it's made a huge impact. And then you compare and contrast that with sort of the maybe couple steps backwards that we are taking here in the United States, especially with the administration's proposal to revisit the fuel economy standards and what those potential implications are at the same time that the federal tax credit for electric vehicles has expired. So this is an incredibly long statement to get to a question, but I do think it's worth us digging in a little bit to understand, for countries that are really lighting the way on greening the economy and putting their money where their mouth is on electrification, we've seen that really does drive demand. So I think let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's talk about, I think it was Daniel who brought up Germany and the Netherlands, that growth is huge. Are there other bright spots outside of the EU, outside of China, that you think is driving this? And then the second part of that question is, as each of these regions seeks to build out its own domestic manufacturing base, there is a little bit of looking inward and wanting to build their own supply chain, their own domestic source of these materials, and bring in value-add manufacturing. So while we look at the subsidies and the policies to drive it, we are also seeing wanting us more of a self-reliance. So do we think all of this can go hand in hand and truly be a global effort? Are there any concerns that a preference for local producers or local materials could sort of upend the global marketplace? So apologies, that was very long, but I just sort of wanted to set the scene for this. So Daniel, I'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. So I think actually the place that I'd like to start is in the US. You mentioned some of the challenges that we're currently facing with progress in that the current administration has taken, looking at a reduction in CAFE standards. I think also worth noting is the lawsuit that they have with several automakers to remove California's authority to regulate its own emissions. Of course, there are now about 15 states that have joined California in subscribing to the belief that they have the ability to regulate above the national standard. And it's that protocol that program that I think is worth highlighting. the ZEV mandate program, the Clean Cars program that was generated by California, provided international inspiration. It is the reason that China set up its subsidies, because they also they recognized they needed to have a stick to go along with all the carrots. In the EU, it's been very different, and they've done things from sort of an emissions target or a target reduction element. But I do think that that in the U.S. we've got two major tools to use as the stick, so to speak. From a federal context, it is going to be CAFE moving forward. From a state context, it's going to be the Clean Cars program, and it's going to be the ZEV mandate. It's a question of what states are going to adhere to that and participate. The reason that the ZEV mandate hasn't been as successful as some of those other programs is because they went first. That program's been in effect since 2012. And as Prasanna mentioned, in 2012, when we all were in this business, it was not for sure which technology, let alone whether the industry as a whole was going to be all that significant or be all that compelling. As a result, you saw a lot of different things put into, different concessions put into that regulation that have ultimately inhibited its ability to be as successful as it otherwise might have been. Lessons learned. And again, with the new target that's being put forward by the governor of that state, provided that California still has the opportunity to regulate its own emissions with that waiver from the Clean Air Act, I would expect that those states which adhere to that regulation will start to pick up and track more along the lines with the rest of the international audience.
Great, thank you. Prasanna, do you want to come in here? You did make some references to both China and the EU in your comments, so maybe you want to build on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'll come at it from a slightly different angle, right? So I think the subsidies and the tax credits, I think they are a great tool to spur short-term growth and adoption rates in EVs. I think clearly the long-term growth is going to come from a couple of different areas. One is sort of the emission standards, right? I think that's going to be a big driver long-term that allows OEMs to plan. Therefore, that allows some of the supply chain to start planning themselves to catch up. Because just remember, right? So the automotive industry, the supply chain is long, it's huge, it's complex. It's going to take time for all of it to come together. And so I think ultimately the long-term driver for this is going to be emission standards, which in turn could be coming from climate change and politics and all of that, right? But at least it has to be the emission standards. So yeah, I think it's clear that the countries that have done a better job of enforcing that or laying out the roadmap and the goals and enforcing that are going to come out of this whole EV situation much better off than countries that don't. So it was an interesting study that was done a while ago that talked about why is Norway so awesome in terms of EV adoption, and what the results of the survey was surprising. The number one reason that customers said was free tolls, that they didn't have to pay tolls at toll roads, right? So you have a lot of different tools at the disposal of the governments to try and sort of make this all go in the right direction. The other part of another answer to your question, Jennifer, is around the supply chain and trying to make it local versus global, right? To me, that it's a outside of China, this is a really hard thing to sort of keep it all in-house, right? And China obviously has a lot of the supply chain locked up, but outside of that, it's really hard. So I think we are going to have to figure out a way to work together. Think of it as a global problem. The supply chain will have to be global, and you can try to localize manufacturing. I think certainly there'll be benefits. So you think about a country like India, right? People don't talk about EVs in India, the government of India is made it a big mission to try and support some of that EV infrastructure and provide incentives for companies to come in and establish local manufacturing. So there's going to be some of that, but ultimately I still think the whole value chain and the supply chain will be a global one. It's going to be really hard to say everything's going to be contained in the EU or the US and even China for that matter.
Thank you. Kevin.
Well, so it's been a really interesting question and great perspective. So I'm not going to try to repeat anything. I think things to think about that come to mind would be how do we take advantage of any short-term policy effort? And then how do we ensure that the long-term policy efforts are sending consistent signals to every aspect of the clean transportation ecosystem? So on the short-term front, I think to expect the entire world supply chain to completely rearrange itself for a short-term recovery process is quite the expectation. But what we can do is we can really try and focus on here is how this expands our recovery effort, right? If we think about incorporating EV charging infrastructure into any of the number of places where it would be appropriately found in recovery investment programs by the US, Canada, Europe, India, China, around the world, you can quickly point to local job creation for the installation, operation, and maintenance. And there's a whole new economy and ecosystem that comes along with it. So if you talk about a drop in the bucket of where the market could go given fleets, light, medium, and heavy duty vehicle sectors, $3 billion of investment in EV charging ecosystem, just for supporting DC fast charging, you're creating 20, 30, 40,000 jobs, depending on how you're structuring some of these funds. So, how do we focus on every aspect of this to tell and make sure that folks appreciate the transformative nature of a short-term investment? On the longer-term side, I won't speak to the vehicle piece, but on the infrastructure side, there are some clear mechanisms that have worked around the world and that are being looked at. So one of those would be a clean fuel standard. It's called in California the low carbon fuel standard, which effectively tries to lower the carbon intensity of the transportation fuels that are made available through that particular mechanism. But what I want to point to is that in California, just in 2019, it generated $2.5 billion for low carbon fuels, over 500 million of which went to EV related investments. Now, this is a really important tool that allows for flexibility, that sends appropriate signals, and that helps to really build ecosystems around its existence. And there is consistent discussion around looking at this across the board in the US. Canada's already pursuing this both at the provincial and the national level. And there's clear evidence of this working. And now as we think about, well, what is the potential downsides to this kind of approach? How do we guard against arguments from detractors from this logical fuel switch? I think at the end of the day, policies like that I just mentioned, in California, gas prices are cheaper today than when the low carbon fuel standard went into effect in 2011. So the boogeyman fear about having appropriate long-term sustainable policies in place like that will negatively impact the consumers of existing technologies are unfounded and untrue. So all of the benefits, none of the risks that are being pointed to scare us from the benefits. I think having both the short term and the long term in mind are really going to be complementary.
Excellent, thank you. We have about 6 minutes left, so I think probably just time for one more question. So I'm going to get a little creative here. Let's fast forward 5 years from now, and we're on this panel again, but we are in person because we can be social again, and we don't have to be 6 feet apart, and the world has been restored to whatever normal is the new normal. What what are we talking about in 5 years from now? Challenges and opportunities. Where are we at as an industry? What's the biggest challenge? What's the biggest opportunity? And Kevin, I've called on you last twice, so now I'm going to call on you first.
Well, it's exciting to think about a future where I don't have my mask on. But I think some of the challenges with being in such an exciting industry, space, policy world in clean transportation is that we often want to talk about all of these things at the same time. There was recently a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission order to look at distributed energy resources and how EVs are going to play a role. And we'll go to different states and different parts of the world, and all folks want to talk about is vehicle to grid and how do we take advantage of the fact that all of a sudden people want to buy these batteries. But at the end of the day, it still has to have wheels on it. But as we start to look further out into the future, you can start to think about what do we have to have in place prepared so that no matter what happens now, like what are the choices we can make now to enable the different outcomes that they could happen between now and 5 years. I think what I hope we'll be talking about in 5 years is that we made the decisions today that allowed for eventual outcomes that could have gone a number of different ways in the future. So what are the foundational pieces we can focus on now? Do we want to say if we like EV charging infrastructure, we should put in, at every place where there's a charger, it must be able to deliver 1 megawatt per port right now? Well, no, that might not be the most appropriate place. Do we want to make sure that FERC has a power switch and they can turn off and on every vehicle? No, but like, what are the things that we have to do now to put us in the place to manage an exciting, rapidly growing, and potentially extremely societally beneficial load on the grid? So I think that's what I'll be happy to celebrate in 5 years' time with all of you.
Good, thank you. Okay, 3 minutes left, Daniel.
So I'm really hoping in 5 years that the transition of fleets and specifically in the medium and heavy duty sector has occurred much more rapidly than what we anticipate today. We're giving a lot of runway for 2045 when you already have ports taking it into their own into their own hands to require full zero emissions by 2030. There are some competing targets here that theoretically should lead to the greater adoption of this technology, again, as the economics become all the more clear. The concern at that point, and what I think we'll be talking about at that point, is how do we really, how do we complete the transition? It's not like we're going to prevent people from purchasing vehicles with internal combustion engine technology, or for that matter, diesel trucks or diesel buses. So it may not be the smartest investment, but how do we elegantly transition to where that we're talking about the retiring of vehicles and those sorts of things to really ensure that the emissions reductions goals that we're seeking come to fruition.
Perfect. 2 minutes left. Prasanna, take it away.
All right. So I'm an optimistic person. So I think a few things are going to happen in the next 5 years, right? So I think the adoption rates are going to go up. I don't think there's any question about it. Whether it's 10% or 8% or 12%, who knows? But I think the adoption rates are going to go up. I'm optimistic that the US is going to be right up there with China and Europe in terms of adoption rate and how they look at EVs and setting up the infrastructure, all of that. I mean, we still dominate innovation, and so I'm very optimistic the US is going to be right up there. I also think that we are going to be closer in terms of the next generation of battery breakthrough, right? The holy grail everybody wants to talk about is solid state. I'm hoping that in 5 years we'll be much closer to actually having a commercial solid state technology available. I saw recently, I think Mercedes had launched a bus with solid state technology in them already. So, we are getting there. So in 5 years, I'm optimistic we'll get there. And then the last one is, I'm optimistic that we'll have a pretty good closed loop chain set up, recycling, right? So, nobody's talked about it yet, but recycling for lithium ion is going to be just as important. It's going to take a long time to catch up to lead acid, but certainly we need to make baby steps. We need to make solid progress towards making sure that we have a closed loop system. So I'm optimistic that we're going to make progress on all of those fronts.
Well, thank you all so much for this very interesting discussion. I think we probably could have spent a lot more time digging into these very interesting policy discussions and really understanding what the picture looks like for us now in a post-COVID world. Thank you. I'd like to mention to the audience that joining us for the Q&A section will be Britta Gross, who's the Managing Director of the Rocky Mountain Institute, where she is focused on zero emissions technology and carbon neutrality. So I think she'll bring a very interesting perspective into the Q&A. So with that, we'll turn it over to you in the audience and be pleased to take your questions.